And soon we will be arriving on another platform, which I think many of you have been waiting to find out about. So we'll have more specific dates to share soon, but for now I hope that quenches the thirst and stops people, rugby tackling me in the corridors. So it's coming, it's happening. So we're going to go all the way back to the start, quickly, to talk about Eve VR. So Eve VR was the prototype. This was the seed of Valkyrie, the game that became Valkyrie. And that was created by a cool bunch of guys in Reykjavik, and they brought it over to Newcastle. I'm not even going to attempt to tell that part of the story. I wasn't around then, so it wouldn't be right for me to talk about it. What I am going to talk about is the time from when I arrived at CCP and we turned Eve VR into Valkyrie and into a full game for release. So we need to quickly go back to the origins of VR. You're going to see lots of stupid pictures of me at various events going, wow, VR's amazing. And that's kind of one of my first experiences. I was blown away. I was at GDC 2014. I was 6th in line for the PlayStation VR, and it was just amazing. I played the Deep, and it blew my mind. And then I went over to Oculus, who just brought out the DK2 at the time, I believe, and were showing it for the first time with Valkyrie. And that just floored me. I mean, this was the experience I'd been waiting for, from the launch tube sequence, getting out there in space, getting a few kills, and my heart was racing. It was the most amazing, adrenaline-fueled experience I'd ever had. And when I took the headset off, I genuinely looked around because I'd imagined wind. I know this sounds crazy because you're in a cockpit, but I imagined wind during the launch tube sequence. And that was how powerful VR was. And that power is something that stuck with me. And so my memories of that day, they almost feel like real experiences. It's very different to the first time I played Mario 64, or, got my ass handed to me on Street Fighter. They still remain as gaming experiences, but my first VR experiences feel very different, almost like real memories. Very powerful, powerful platform. So we knew, obviously, VR, everyone was hoping it was going to be, consumer VR would launch and it would be really successful. And for me, when Sony announced that they were joining the market on this made it real. I'm a console gamer, boo, but you've got to admit, Sony know how to, make games, and it was really cool to see one of the big console players join. And then, we're looking at it thinking consumer VR is going to happen. This is really going to happen. So it was a really exciting period. And I was so excited that I came home, and I was like, oh my God, this is the best thing ever. And I grabbed a it was DK1 set that we had in the office. I came home and I was messing with prototypes. That's my dog kind of looking really confused. What's going on? And it was really, really basic stuff. I was just in a room and I'm just messing with kind of geometry. But I was still there. There was a sense of presence, which was just absolutely incredible compared to traditional 2D gaming. And I realized at that time that game design was about to evolve. It was about to go into a whole new era. And it was incredibly exciting, and I wanted to be a part of it. And the reason I wanted to be a part of this is because I was lucky enough to go to Disneyland. My parents took me there when I was a kid. And I was blown away by things like the Haunted Mansion. And Disney hire people called Imagineers, and they structure every part of that experience. So the minute you get in line at the Haunted Mansion, the attention to meticulous detail is just overwhelming. There's gravestones with people's names on, all of the walkways that you queue in before you even get on the ride. They make you feel like you're part of that world. They make you feel like you're in this New Orleans Haunted Mansion experience. All of the staff are in character the whole time you're there. You enjoy the ride, which is just incredible, and you come out, and even the exit keeps that fantasy. And for me, VR was the first platform that kind of said, we can deliver that, an end-to-end fantasy. From the minute I put on the HMD, head-mounted display, I'm there, I'm in that world, and it was really important. It wasn't about just the gameplay, it was about the sensation of being somewhere that could teleport you to another world. So I joined CCP. Now, CCP Newcastle, it's a very small team. We've not got much bigger than this. This is a more recent photo. I should point out there, we are holding PlayStation 4 boxes. So you might be looking and saying, this isn't the Oculus launch. No, it's not. This is a recent one. But we were probably about 28 when I joined, and we got as big as maybe 40, but we've never been over 40. So it's a very small team. And that's been really critical in how we make decisions, and how we kind of plan out our roadmap of features. So, quick kind of overview, we had an amazing gameplay. We had, team deathmatch. We had the combat. But what we needed to do is we needed to take that very immediate experience and scale it up to create a full game. So what I'm going to do for you now is go through the initial blueprint. And a blueprint really is just lots and lots of game design docs put together to show an overall kind of vision for the game. And our mission for Valkyrie was simple, and our message was simple. It was just, this is not a demo. There's lots of experiences and demos around. We're not that. We are a full game. But before I dive into the blueprint, I've got my first factoid. If I have time, there'll be 3 factoids. So factoid number 1 about Valkyrie is that we import a lot of assets from a little game you might have heard on. It's Steve Online or something like that. Yeah, it's a space game. Anyway, we take a lot of the assets straight from EVE Online, but when we put them into the Valkyrie world, we need to upscale them by 1.5. And that's basically to account for the speed of our ships. Our Wraith flies at, Emily will kill me if I forget this, 200 meters per second. So when you're traveling that fast, blink and you miss it. So in order to compensate for that and give that greater sense of speed, we have to scale the assets up to accommodate for it. There'll be 2 more, promise. So the blueprint. Why do we have a blueprint? Firstly, it's to communicate. So it's to get the support of the team so that everyone knows that the game we're making, how it affects their work and how they can input to it and make things better and add things on. It also then shows you the structure of the game. So it shows things like progression. It shows like different features and how they're going to plug in. And it'll also help you plan. So if you know you've only got X amount of development time, it'll allow you to say, well, we could do without that, we can live without this bit, and then we'll put it in at a later date when we can develop it. And it also just basically allows you to scrutinize your work. So kind of presenting all of this out as a full-on game design doc, it allows you to spot holes. So these are not technical game design docs, it's more like an overview of the game. So I'm going to show you, depending on time, I'm going to go as quickly as I can through the blueprint which I presented to the team. This was in June 2015. It's an edited version, but it has to be edited because there's some secrets in there that we can't talk about just yet, but it is pretty honest in a lot of areas. So the first thing that we needed to do was solve the fantasy of what PvP is for us. And so the first step was basically, what is PvP? It's a war, basically. It's the war of the Valkyrie. It's this eternal war between Fatal and Realm. And we needed that as like the overarching fantasy of what it meant to be in Valkyrie and be fighting. Don't worry, I'll zoom in on this. That's the bit of information we need to look at here. So the game modes that we had planned for PvP initially were Deathmatch. Now, we kind of abandoned this one quite quickly. It didn't fit with the nature of team-based combat. And also it felt a little bit weird because there was a weird fantasy of launching from a carrier and then attacking the same people that launched from the carrier. And we always thought that we could return to this at a later date and the fantasy could become more of a VR simulation. But for us, it was very important that the Valkyrie war, the PvP element, was the real thing. This was happening right now. This was the current. And then when we came to look at the PvE side of things, that was a simulation. That was the VR within VR. So we had Team Deathmatch, which we got shot of. And we'll see what happens. We may bring that at a later date. We had, Team Deathmatch, which was eliminate the enemies. It just does what it says on the tin. Very easy to pick up and play, and that's like one of our core exhilarating Tom Cruise in space Top Gun moments. And then we had Control, which is an objective-based game mode. And we were missing a main event at that time, and we needed something to tie it all together. And that was what Armada was, and that's probably the first time you've heard the term Armada, but that was the development name that we had for Carrier Assault at the time. I knew nothing about Ernest Cline's book, and it was pointed out, how can it be an Armada? There's only 2 ships, but it was a cool name, all right? But we changed that. And what this did is it tied everything together, so the fantasy became all about clones, that clones were the ultimate resource. So this was what you're trying to get, diminish your opponent's clone resources. So whether that was in Team Deathmatch, physically emptying their clone vats, whether it was in Control, draining the clone vats by capturing objectives, or whether it was in Carrier Assault by totally destroying the carrier. And that pretty much drains it definitively. So Carrier Assault itself evolved quite a bit. It was a lot more complex than the version which we have out now, but it changed for the better. It was almost too complex. So you would actually bring down the shields of the carrier in stages. And stuff like this is quite hard to actually feed back in VR. So just to give you an example, we've got outer shields disabled, sentry guns activated, and then you'd have hit points exposed, the critical core exposed. which some of those, the last three are kind of steps which we kept, but we had this sway of power. So depending on which objectives you held, you could bring down the shields gradually in terms of a percentage. So you'd see the enemy's team and you would see 100%, and then you'd be draining more kind of power from the shields. You would get down to 20% and up to the point where the shields were down fully and you could launch an attack. Now, calling this stuff out in VR with everything else that's going on in the world is a bit of a nightmare. And the gameplay wasn't as fun, because what happened is you had people attacking and defending at different times, and it split the teams. So it was a much better idea that you basically had very pronounced gameplay phases. You were all in attack, which means the other team defend. You were all in defend, which means the other team attack. And so this works a lot better, and it was something that we just had to try, and we just had to keep playing it. And that's why it took us a while in-house to get everything just spot on before we launched it. There was a few things actually changed, stayed pretty much the same. These are the sentry gun radiuses, and the idea was that the sentry guns would cover some of the hit points, so that you were always in range of cannon fire, in addition to the other players which would be flying around trying to kill you. The defense turrets would also have a good shot at you. So you could take those down if you wanted to make life easier. And then we also had randomized hit points. Now, I believe the first version we had 20 hit points, the critical hit points. Sorry, not the critical hit points, the cooling nodes. And the idea was it would randomize. So you'd have 20, and then it would give you 10 of those 20, and it would just randomize between game modes. We actually shipped with 50 and 25, I believe, as like the final totals that are out there. And another thing that changed in development is initially these were like one-hit blasts. So you'd hit a cooling node, pow, it would go, and then you'd move on to the next. But to draw out that gameplay and make it more exciting, we kind of upped the health of the cooling nodes just to create more drama points and tension around the carrier battle. And of course, once you got them down, pow, core was exposed, and we got our trench run moment. And this was something else that we iterated on. At the time, we thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool for that moment where you get that one shot and you hit the core and it just goes nuclear? But again, it didn't feel that satisfying. We wanted all of the players to feel like they'd taken a valid role in making the core go critical and blowing up the carrier. So we upped the health on the actual critical path as well. So this was our main event. We kind of knew with Team Deathmatch that we'd nailed that Battlestar Galactica vibe, the combat. And this for us was, our homage to that Star Wars feeling that I think we all wanted. So a little bit about PvE. Again, I'll zoom in on this. But the fantasy for this was that our PvE stuff is basically a VR fantasy within VR fantasy. It's VR kind of experiences within our game, and it's the memories of dead pilots, basically. And we use them to create missions which will educate our newer pilots, and also for fun. So it means that we can have the recall missions, which are self-contained kind of narrative missions that may or may not be linked. You can go in there, you can enjoy it, you can learn some of the lore of Valkyrie, and you can get used to some of the mechanics and the features which you'll be using in PvP. So it's primarily there to educate and obviously to enjoy. And it also allowed us, from a production side of things, to control how and when we delivered our PvE content. Because as I was saying before, it's a very small team. We need to put all of our resources primarily into PvP, because that's the heart and soul of Valkyrie. But we knew, despite saying we're not making a campaign, that people still wanted PvE elements. And this allowed us it allows us more control over how and when we release them, and so we can release them when it's right. We had another mode called Evaluation, which was basically like the recall mode, but you got a score based on how you did. We just dropped that because it simply didn't offer enough gameplay differences between recall mode. And we also had Endurance, which was what then became Survival. And Scout mode we shipped with as well, which remained unchanged. The idea there just be that let you fly around and enjoy flying in VR space, which is something everyone wanted to do. We also had asynchronous multiplayer challenges, and these were kind of self-contained, almost obstacle courses where you would fly a route, you would shoot targets, you would do all kinds of cool things, and then you'd get a rating on it. And asynchronous challenges, you would then upload a score, you would compare it with people. So it was a way to have a multiplayer experience that was kind of offline in a way, because you were sitting there, you'd basically put your score, you would upload it, and then you would compare it on the leaderboards. Now, again, This is one thing that we ran out of time on, but what the methodology that we used was quite interesting, rational game design and level design methodology, so you don't have to squint too much at this Excel overload here, but we looked at a huge range of modifiers, so the size of targets, the quantity of targets, the pattern predictability, the speed, everything, to create all of these wonderful combinations where we could make basically obstacle courses where we could review your performance on them. Now, for something like this to work, you really need at least 50 to then play test it and edit it down to 10. And again, like I said, we just simply ran out of time. So it's a very crude mock-up of what I'm talking about here. But that might actually look familiar because, again, with a lot of the things, although we decided that that feature wasn't worth pursuing at that time because there were more important things to do, we took a lot of the learnings from this exercise and incorporated them into our training module. So, the idea of rotating your wingtips to make sure you go through at the right angle. So the other thing that we needed was obviously a quality player progression. And what you need first is a bold statement, is what am I doing? What are all of the things that happen? Well, how does that tie back to me as I advance my pilot? And it came back to the fact that you're a pirate, and this was basically combat and plunder, which were our kind of core things. Get out there and fight, and then share the spoils of war. So with a lot of the game modes and a lot of the features that we looked at, we ask ourselves the question, how does that then tie back to me? How does pilot reputation and me becoming more and more of a badass pilot tie back to these kind of notions, combat, plunder, fame, and fortune? And so this is a very early pass on our first progression flow. And again, we wanted to appeal to different kinds of gamers. So we have the appeal to combat, which would be kills, assists, heals, captures. This is the visceral side of being in dogfighting. And then also something to appeal to the collectors. And that's why we had salvage, so that it was something that people who were, might not be as sharpshootery as some of the other people, particularly in this room, but they can actually benefit from harvesting some of that loot. And the idea that this shared economy could then be shared out with all the pilots at the end of the battle, and it was a really cool thing that you felt a part of. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this flow because we're running really quick on time. But basically, whatever you did, you got rewarded for. So if you flew as a fighter and you earned XP as a fighter, that would then feed back in to increase your fighter progression, and it would also increase your pilot reputation. And the same was true with the other ship classes. So if you use a heavy, you would basically get kills and earn score in the heavy, and that XP would then feed back into your overall pilot reputation. So your reputation, your rank is the overall stat, but we kind of judge you on all of the activities that you do. So this is an early version of the progression. This was the pilot reputation all the way up to rank 50, and then this was the separate ship progressions. And that shows where the blueprints were unlocked at each stage. You can see it's quite staggered. So initially, again, it's one of these things that we iterated on. We thought that if someone uses the fighter and gains loads of experience in the fighter, they'll be a better heavy pilot. And then when they know enough about the heavy, they'll know enough about the complexities of the controls to then pilot a support craft effectively. But that wasn't always the case. So when we actually were in alpha period, a lot of people were saying, well, you've given us all these cool toys, but no one's playing with them because they're buried halfway down a progression. And that's no good. So, we kind of chopped it back and we came further and further and back. And with every iteration, all the way up to PSVR launch, we were iterating down and getting that number closer. So now the reality is that when you basically have 2 or 3 battles, if you're getting some good kills, you will unlock the heavy, the fighter, the heavy, the fighter, and the support before you even hit rank 5, which is really cool. And that just gets the toys in the hands of the players sooner so that they experiment with it and actually find what ship class suits them best. So it's another exercise, and as designers, we put a lot of rules in there because we think that's what we should do. And then as a player, you sit back and go, why can't I have those toys? Get them to the players as quickly as possible. And so a little bit about mechanical upgrades. So these blueprints that you unlock, this should have been a celebratory moment. So you got a blueprint, which meant that you can now go and upgrade. You could get new ships. You could get new ship upgrades, which will improve your fighter stats, so it would improve your damage and your rate of fire. And these were all crafted using salvage. So this was still the shared spoils of war. That's the green glowing stuff that we need to do a better job of tutorializing in the PvP. But when you collect the green glowing stuff, that's going into that pot, and everyone feels the benefit at the end of the match because they get to craft these cool things. And so that's a quick snapshot of the flow for that, very easy. Salvage collected goes into the 3 different categories. We've got common, rare, and epic, which became base, prime, and component. Make sure that's right. And then you simply take it to the quartermaster, give him some silver, and he crafts it for you. And this is an overview of the progression. It's a bit of a top-down view. This again shows the structure of the fighter progression leading into the heavy progression, which is on the bottom of the screen, and the support on the top. And you can see it's incredibly linear. So your choices under this version were, what upgrades do I craft? But even those upgrades were kind of coming at very distinct points. So it might be that you hit 10,000 fighter XP and you got, a blueprint, then 12,000 it was another blueprint. So it was very linear. And this is something, again, that we iterated on after playing it multiple times to see what felt right. So this kind of breadcrumbing of goodies within the game massively changed as we kind of evaluated it and then concertinaed stuff up so that you could get the good stuff quicker. We also had a weird prerequisite to the crafting, so it was like you had to have crafted the thing before in order to get the thing that you just unlocked. And we got a lot of feedback from that and said, why? I don't want it. You shouldn't have to buy it. It's like you've unlocked something, but you think, I'm not interested in that ship because the abilities of that ship don't match me as a gamer and the way I play. I'll just leave it. I'll keep my salvage, I'll keep my silver, I'll invest it in the next ship when that becomes unlocked. So again, totally softening up and make sure we get the toys quicker. Now, quick word on stats on VR. This is going to be the kind of the message of my next section of this when we finish with the blueprint, but stats in VR, man, they suck. So text is not good in VR. I mean, it's clear, it's not about resolution, it's just not fun to read. So this is something that we did very recently as we took all of the information that people were looking at about their pilot and the progression that we've just chatted about and made it far more visual. So, the idea was that you would see your pilot, stick with me here, and you'd be surrounded in a brain, a huge VR digital brain, and these are the neurons that fire up depending on what kind of a player you are. So if you're playing and completing a lot of PvE events, one side of the brain's going to light up versus another side, and depending on how you kind of invest in your ships and your progression, different neurons will light up at different times. So just to round up the kind of the blueprint stuff, this was a quick look. We had the Galactic News Network, which was going to be our hub that gave all of the information. We had leaderboards on there, which we had in, friends list, had daily quests, which became daily challenges. We had VR challenges, which we put on hold for the time being. Adverts, which would be to give you up-to-date information about new ships and stuff as that was going to be made available. We also had the notion of a meta clan, but that's something that we figure we can put that on hold for now. And as the community gets to the size where we can really get the mechanics and the hooks in to support a meta clan, we'll bring it online. We also had match results, rewards, and a session summary, which we, shipped with. So factoid number 2, just checking my time. I'm good. Just got the axe man. Factoid number 2 is that there are no same-sized assets as the player in the game. And this is to avoid something which we call lamppost effect. It's when you're traveling towards something that's of the same size, and it's only when you get right up close to it you realize, holy shit, we're gonna hit, and you collide, and it feels cheap. And so, we try to push the scale up so that the things that you see, I need to avoid this, or it's so small that you think that's going to bounce off my cockpit window. Simple. So a little bit about the evolution of the UI and why VR is kind of one of those things that we evolved as we went along. This was what we thought was cool early in the days of VR. We're like, this is amazing, we've got all this space, we've got this holo table, and look at these kind of 3D assets, and this is amazing, the screens everywhere, it's like sci-fi. But it's not really, it wasn't that big a wow. It was a wow to us because it was the first thing that we did and put in the game. But really, it wasn't kind of delivering the impact that we wanted. Now, the fantasy behind this was that you were in a control room, and so you were overlooking like the carrier, and this was like a command center. So the first thing that we did was remove the walls of the command center, and then we kind of pushed the holo table out in front of you so that it felt like you had a lot more space. The screens stopped being physical screens and became projected, almost AR artifacts within the world, and it was just a lot more had a lot more wow. The assets were sized up and you could rotate them. That's a cool preview of Cathedral there. But it still kind of missed something, which was, it's back to that cohesive fantasy of like, well, what am I doing? Before I was in the office and I'm sat looking outside on my carrier. What am I doing now? I'm in a cargo bay and there's no room. I mean, I'm sitting on a crate. And the breakthrough moment for us was the fact that the UI and all of these elements was going to come from you. It was going to emit from you. So you were going to be at the center of this, and this would be via a wearable PDA, a device which basically projected out all of the elements that we needed into the scene. And those were elements which we needed in a lot of different scenes. It wasn't just the main menu, it was the multiplayer menus, it was after session results, and it all had to be consistent. So this was the breakthrough. Everything comes from you, projected out. And it's portable as well, which is brilliant. So you can take it between any scene you want. And it also made us give us a good fantasy, because like, what am I doing? You know, where am I? I'm just chilling on a crate, but it's all right. You know, I think we're all familiar with this, you know, the device in the hand, staring at the device while chilling somewhere. And that meant that we could kind of wrap it all together in a nice tight fantasy. And we kind of thought that we kind of coined the phrase AR within VR, the idea being that as we projected these things out, there were AR elements within our VR game which you could interact with and would give you kind of information. I'll show you there's some better shots of the elements placed on the screen, but one of the other things we did here as well is we removed the screens. So once we kind of put this new system in, we decided we can get rid of the screens, and we had this radius that just drew out in front of you, and we could just drop assets in, and you could then interrogate the information on the assets, just like you would with a lot of AR applications. Still wasn't enough though. We like to keep pushing ourselves, and we've learned that you've got to dial it to 11 before you come back to 10. And so, you know, influenced by a lot of kind of popular science fiction, you know, we gave ourselves the brief, how do we put the player in the middle of a planetarium? How do we have someone just stood looking around going, oh my God, this is almost to the point of being overwhelming. And so that was the brief that we gave ourselves, and the UI that we actually shipped with for the planet selection for all of the game modes was exactly like this. It was like being in a planetarium, and you looked at these things and the metadata kind of appeared. So it would tell you what the planet was, and then you'd zoom into it, you'd select the game modes from here, and you'd launch the modes. But it was fantastic, but we had a few issues with head tracking, you know, and actually the selection of these assets. And the more we put in the scene, the more complex that got. And so we're kind of banging our heads against the wall a little bit on this. We're thinking, well, we've got this infinite space in VR. It's amazing. Why are people missing this critical information? And so we had to kind of revisit the theory of how we perceive the world around us. So I've got to give credit to Vincent McCurley, who drew these images. We didn't actually look at this when we were revising ours, but they illustrate the point beautifully. And it's not an issue which is unique to VR. It's an issue to do with us as humans. You know, we have a very kind of strong focal area. So as I'm looking around, I can focus on people and I see a lot of detail and data, but our peripheral vision, we've got strong peripheral vision, but between here and here, there's a chasm. You know, if something happens just to my side, I can look and give it my attention, and then I can start understanding and processing that information, but you need to grab my attention. You need to force me to move my head. And so we started looking at, you know, the field of view of where we are. And Valkyrie obviously was sat down, so it's not a seated experience. You're in your chair, you're in your pilot seat, and so your natural gaze is forward. So if we look at like the first image, that is kind of a natural gaze forward, and then the focal point of what you want, the salient information is right in front of you, and then we have the opportunity to grab your attention a little bit to the sides. And so this is a comfortable place. The second image shows roughly where we can get your attention with peripheral stuff. So if we flash something just to the side or your left or right, we could get your attention and cause you to move your focus to it and then give you more information. And over on the third slide, this is the absolute limit of where we could even hope to get your attention. And this is even by flashing things and doing audio signals to say, hey, look over here. You know, and we're not owls, you know, we can only go so far, and even a swivel chair, we could maybe get around there. But this was something that we needed to solve. And we had a lot of information. We wanted the wow, but we also wanted to get players' attention and focus them in on the information which they needed to understand so they could make decisions on it. So that brings us on to the other evolutionary trait, which is our perception of size. Beautifully illustrated by the T-Rex from Jurassic Park, which is, you know, objects in the mirror are closer than they appear. And it's another kind of trait of how we've evolved, basically. We think that things that are close to us are more important. And so, again, we looked at the rules behind this and tried to look at some best practices for where we could place things so that they would be noticed by the player as being something important and deliver the information And we looked at different distances for this. The first one says 0.5 meters in VR space. I think Oculus now recommend like 0.75. But basically, this is the minimal distance that we can put something in VR before you either become cross-eyed or before you just don't process it. It's just too big to understand. And then there's the strong depth perception, stereoscopic depth perception, happens around about the 10-meter mark, and that kind of stretches out to around the 20-meter mark, which is when the information gradually degrades to the point where you see something in the distance and you think it's less important, so you don't give it your focus. So when you combine the radius and the vision cone, you get something roughly like this, and this is like almost like a best guide placement. So if you were going to make a kind of an interface in VR, you would look to be placing things within this optimum zone. So it's optimum in terms of the scale, and it's optimum in terms of where it's placed on the vision cone. And by a bizarre coincidence, we ended up with that, which is, and we had nothing to do with this research before. We'd not seen these images, but it was almost a mirror of these findings. And that was what we were doing. We're experimenting with these radius and where we could place things for maximum effect. So this is the one we actually shipped with now, if you go home and play the game. So this is the one we've iterated to. So if you go home and power Valkyrie on, when you go home, this is what you'll see. And it's a combination of things. So we've found this happy middle ground where we can have the VR wow of having these cool planets around you, but you can either use your gaze to take in the information, or you can rotate them to bring the information closer to you. And we also have, we've got a more optimum space for kind of placing the meta information. So just in front and slightly behind, and people are starting to, the early tests we've done on the new UIs proved really successful. People are actually understanding the menus and navigating them more kind of naturally, and it's getting back to what we really wanted from it, which was wow, but with all of the information. It's a bit of a running joke in the office. It's like, when are we going to overhaul the UI again? So this is the very first version of the hangar. Imagine. It's a bit, what is this, a hangar for ants? It's so we put this in and we're like, well, we need the players to be able to grab the ships quickly, to toggle between the ship classes, to understand where the ships are within the progression, and basically understand what they need to craft them. So we dumped all of this information down at once. And at the time it made sense because all of the holotable was in front of us and we could quickly sort through the info. But it lacks that wow. So again, back to those lessons I explained before, turn it up to 11 first. So we took the notion of being at an air show, that feeling when I was a kid and my dad took me to an air show and I'm stood in front of an F-15 and I'm just like, oh my God, this is the biggest, most amazing, imposing, cool-ass military vehicle I've ever seen. How do we do that in VR? And so we took that idea and put it into the way that we actually display the ships in the hangar at the minute. We tried a lot of interesting ideas, like on paper, thankfully, because it's less expensive, for how we moved between the ships. So the idea of having a moving platform, which basically took you through the hangar, and you could stand in front of all of the ships and look at them in more detail, even looking and pointing and kind of teleporting to places. But ultimately, we needed functionality. So functionality is critical, it's key. So between battles, players needed to be in there, needed to be tinkering with the ships and their upload and their upgrades and the customization options, so we couldn't have these long kind of prolonged loading screens or shifts between spaces. So we settled for a happy compromise, which I'm sure you'll agree is still pretty impressive. We've got the ship model in front of you, this huge behemoth of a heavy, and it brings up the information which you need. So it's got eye-tracked elements, but you can also rotate it on the stick and kind of spin it all the way around and appreciate the wow and the splendor. And this is what we've got, more of a zoomed out view. And what we're doing here is we're combining elements. So you have head-tracked assets in front of you, which are at a comfortable viewing distance, and you can click to toggle between the categories. You then have the rotating wheel, which is used on the analog stick, which brings the ships around so that you can then tinker them with more head-tracked assets, which again are placed at optimum distances so that you can look up, gaze, and quickly get onto launch tubes and stuff. It's still not perfect. There's so much information we've got to get in there, and we are still, we're still learning lessons every day. And I wouldn't be surprised if in 6 months' time I'll be stood here going, this is the new hangar. So closing thoughts just for this section. Basically, this is all I wanted to go into on the design side for now. Is 2D thinking is really hard to break. We work on 2D screens every day. This is how we design. And half the time we'll put things in the game and we'll look at them on a 2D screen, and we can't do that. You know, moving forward as VR game creators, everything has to be validated in VR. It's, you know, we're getting to the point, hopefully, where we'll get tools to almost edit on the fly within VR, and it's hugely important because it just looks so different. When you get that HMD on and you're in that world, that validates all of your findings pretty quickly. Second one, as I've said a few times now, dial it up to 11 and tune it back. It's much easier to just throw everything in the kitchen sink and be overwhelmed and go, holy shit, this is the best thing ever, and then worry about what the key information is that you need to call out and what people need to understand. And then you can iterate back to the point where you get the wow, but you also get the clarity and the functionality and the usability, which are all really important. And also what happens when the buzz fades, and this is kind of twofold. It's like, what happens when you've got over that overwhelming sensation of I'm in the hangar and I've seen this ship a million times? Is it still got that functionality? Does it still have that usability? And you could also interpret that statement as what happens when the buzz of VR fades in terms of gameplay. You know, there are experiences where you can go in there and go, this is amazing, but it will become the norm. So when that buzz fades, you've got to have a quality game. You've got to have quality mechanics and features, and that's basically what it's all about. It's making a game which is going to stand the test of time, but is in VR. And the last one there, text looks rubbish. Seriously, it looks rubbish. Like I said multiple times, it does look rubbish. So particles, we use, this is my factoid number 3, it's the final one. I think we've made it, and I'm probably out of time. I've got 5 minutes, that's cool. So when you're flying through spaces, large open spaces, we use sensor speed particles, which are really small fragments, which don't have any collision, but gives you that sensor speed, it enhances it. Without those, if you have large areas of open space, it feels incredibly slow, even though you're flying at 200 meters per second. So quick bit about some of the things which have helped us get to this point. So the alpha period is something which is just, we couldn't have done without. It's just been invaluable. The feedback that we got during alpha stage, to put a mask on and do this properly, it was amazing. It allowed us to validate. It allowed us to iterate. It allowed us to experiment with mechanics and features and basically get to a point where we had a game that we were really proud of and that we could get out there for launch day on Oculus. And it also helps with, it's a horrible phrase, but when to kill your babies. You know, as a designer, as creators, you have this long list of things that you think everything's more important. And you're like, that's the most important thing in the game. And then the players helped us kind of define the fact that, yeah, you might have designed that and you might be really proud of it, but that's not what people want. They want this. And so it allowed us, it informed the decisions we made in alpha. So we launched on Oculus. Woo! We were there from day one. We wanted to be a poster child for VR, and we were there in the Oculus homepage. And it was a fantastic moment. It was brilliant, but it was, as much as it was a celebration, it was also a moment where we're like, there's still so much we want to do. There's still so many things that we wanted for the game which we couldn't get in time. And as one reviewer had said, it's a great game, but it's lacking a main event. And we knew that. You know, we knew that basically the main event, Carrier Assault, was yet to come. And despite saying no campaign repeatedly, some people were asking where the campaign was, but and where the confusion came from. There's no campaign. But we finally got the chance to get our main event in there in June this year, and we delivered Carrier Assault. And this was basically the showstopper game mode that we wanted. It was our defining experience for Valkyrie. It was the wow moment, taking down the carrier. And I'm sure as many of you have experienced when that thing goes critical and you're flying past and the flames are, it's just great. And now we're getting to experience it all over again with a lot of my friends who have bought in for PlayStation VR, and yeah, it's some good matches to come. And so this was kind of our fulfillment of game as a service. This was the first big step. This was an update. We could continue to improve and iterate on our systems and features. And that continued with Joint Strike, which obviously I'm sure you're all aware of, happened this month, and this was for the launch of PlayStation VR. We added a ton of new cool features. We expanded on the social features. This is only the start of that journey. But we got this in and ready for cross-platform play, which is just incredible. The first moment, you know, we were online and we saw the PlayStation VR flight suits appearing in the clone vat beside it. It was a wonderful moment. It was like, there's all these new guys, this is class. And so we were there for the launch of PSVR. Now this might look like the most unhealthy match from Match.com dating website, but this is what happened. It's a fun night out right there. So we're there for the launch of PSVR, and so far it's been amazing. And that journey is going to continue, as I said earlier, you know, with the launch of the Vive version as well. This is really essential for VR, I think. You know, the idea that we can play games together regardless of platform, it's huge. You know, it's huge in terms of getting the numbers together. It's also huge in terms of just breaking down any kind of boundaries. I think most of the people in the industry are predicting that this is going to be the start of something which, you know, goes further afield. So, a quick look at our timeline. So I explained Carrier Assault, we had that in June, and obviously Joint Strike, which was just recently in October. You'll notice there's a little bit of a teaser image there. Don't worry, I'll zoom in on that in a second. But you know, this is a game as a service. We're not charging for these updates. All of these things are coming real soon and next year. And what we do at the minute is we have what we call patches, and patches are things that deal with fixing issues, what we call build hardening, which is improving things. And we might put a couple of new features in a patch as well, but then we'll have update. And an update is something which is like a major content drop, and that's all of the cool new stuff. And I can't talk too much about it, but I'll just expand the teaser image for you there. Give you the time it takes for me to sip a glass of water to take that in. Stroke the spider bot. So you've processed that. That's okay. I'll just say thank you, and that's it. That's it from me. I don't think I ran on too much. So have we got time for a couple of questions or 2 questions? 2 minutes. Oh, they're going to have to be quick questions. Does anyone have any questions apart from what is the specific date of the Vive version in November? Yes?
I've written up to this contract simulator, and I was wondering, you're talking about scaling assets up and down based on the perspective of what, like the license effect and that kind of stuff. That's got to be, and I know there's your stuff, but like it's got to be difficult though to multiplayer. So you've got all these different scenes, right, where some people are seeing objects larger than they actually appear.
Yeah.
Is that difficult to account for?
It's seriously, it's just about playtesting. It's getting away from the 2D screens, and it's about getting a range of the assets in the game to see what they look like. You know, when we did testing with the size of the fighters, even the wraiths, when you see each other facing off, if you take away the HUD elements and you take away the target bracketing, which calls it out in the scene, it's quite hard to actually keep track. You know, so you'll be flying around, and it's almost like, you know, it is literally this huge spaceship, but it just doesn't feel real until it's right in front of you. So I think it's just about experimentation. It's about getting these things in and getting them moving. So my advice is, you know, if you could have these things, even if it was on an AI, a very basic spline, where you have a series of different sized assets moving around in a scene which you think is going to be, you know, your terra firma. My scene stays the same. I get the assets to the scale that I want within the scene, and then almost put them on like scale extra tracks, you know, and just fly around it yourself and see them within VR. I think that'll really help inform your decisions. So basically, boot it and play it. Yeah, it's the #1 way to do it. One more quick one.
Can we please have a show in Southeast
Pretty please.
Pretty please. I'll have a word with some dudes. That's cool. Anything else? Are we good? I'm not going to get wrong then for overrunning. Thank you very much. Thank you. Take my spider bot back.